Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Climate change is either the biggest threat facing humanity, with the potential to wreak havoc and cause food shortages, droughts, flooding, and even wars, or it's exaggerated and has become more about the politics of the environment rather than the science, depending on which side of the coin you fall on. The science of climate change and what role humans are playing in it has been the subject of fierce debate, but the reality seems largely uncontested. The planet is getting warmer. A recent report in Russia said temperatures there rose at twice the rate as seen in the rest of the world over the past century. But are we getting any closer to understanding why warming is happening and what the implications of it might be? And after the failure to reach a binding agreement to tackle climate change at the Copenhagen summit, are we any closer to finding any global solutions? I'm joined here in the studio in London by Professor Peter Wadhams. He's Professor of Ocean Physics at Cambridge University. Professor Anthony Costello, Professor of International Child Health and Director of UCL's Institute for Global Health. By Dr. Benny Peiser, he's Director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. And on the line from Moscow by Alexei Kokorin, he's Climate and Energy Program Director of the World Wildlife Fund. Alexei Kokorin, let me start with you. This report from Russia would seem to be quite alarming. Why does Russia appear to be warming at double the rate of the rest of the world?
Yes, it's the case that due to Russian Emergency Ministry as well as Russian Hydrometeorological Service, growth in temperature in Russia is about 2 times more than globally. So globally it's about 0.8. In Russia, it's above 1.5. Moreover, in some regions or in some seasons, it's 2 times more. So it's really very serious. It's the fact. And Russian scientists now, in spite of the situation 5 or 10 years ago, have no doubts that anthropogenic impact is very, very significant, and Russia should be accounted as one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. It's happening because of atmospheric physics. Then we have increase in greenhouse gas effect due to anthropogenic CO2 and other emissions. We have larger increase in temperature in polar regions, Arctic and Antarctic, and more intensive circulation south-north and less intensive circulation west-east. In the result, we have very sharp alterations of relatively warm temperature from south and relatively cold temperature from north. So they have sharp alterations, what is damage, what is really dangerous effect.
Peter Wadhams, why in your view might we be seeing warming in Russia taking place at a faster rate than elsewhere?
Well, I'd agree with the results. Suddenly they've been seen in other data sets. There's a data set by NASA that's just come out on warming between 64 and 90 degrees north, and they have also found that it's more than double the rate at lower latitudes, so that we've had a warming of about almost 2 degrees since the late 60s in that latitude range. So it's certainly real, and but it's a warming which is affecting all the high latitude regions of the planet, especially inland regions. They're warming faster than the ocean, the ocean region. So that the interior of Russia and the interior of Canada, Canadian North, are both warming very fast. And insofar as the ocean's concerned, one of the effects of that is that it's causing a retreat of the sea ice, especially in summer. It's retreating at all seasons relative to what it used to be, but now the biggest effect is in the summer, so that we now have very large areas of open water north of Russia in the summer months, and that's having a very big further effect in that because the seabed is warming up. This is on the continental shelf. This is causing the offshore permafrost to melt and releasing large quantities of methane. So recent expeditions last year and the year before have been seeing huge plumes of methane coming out of the ocean surface in the summer in the East Siberian Sea, which is, and since methane is a very powerful climatically active gas, that's really going to cause a boost to global warming.
This idea that warming by 2 degrees that we're seeing in places like Russia. That in itself is what you were saying could become a vicious circle and actually in itself increase warming.
Yes, it's leading to positive feedbacks, because that amount of warming is itself causing the snow line to retreat, and the retreat of the snow line on land causes a reduction in the average albedo, which means that less energy is being reflected back out. So you're getting feedback that way. You're getting a feedback because of the sea ice retreat, which is also having an albedo effect. And then there's another feedback caused by the warming of the ocean in the ice-free region, causing the release of methane. So there are a number of feedbacks, all of which unfortunately are positive, and causing the warming rates to accelerate. So this 2 degrees is really, unfortunately, just a start to what we're going to be seeing during this century.
Anthony Costello, you wrote a report saying that climate change is one of the biggest health threats facing us in the 21st century. Can you just elaborate on that a bit? I mean, many people wouldn't initially link the two.
No, I think that's right. Neither did I. I mean, I've only really become familiar with all the climate science and the implications of this in the last 3 or 4 years. And at first I thought it was largely about sort of, losing a few polar bears and having slightly warmer weekends. And it didn't strike me that it was a massive health problem. But when you look at it, I mean, obviously there's the most direct effects. If you have heat waves like we had in Europe in 2003, when the epidemiology shows anywhere up to about 70,000 people died from the effects of heat stress, largely elderly people. And of course, across the world, there are the effects of heat waves which go unmonitored because we don't actually document the number of deaths that occur. You've got the direct effects of things like storms and floods. We know that storm frequency and intensity has increased. We saw what the devastation that's happened from, for example, the Pakistan flood that occurred 18 months ago, which was in fact linked to the Russian heat wave, I believe, climatically, which I'll come on to. And then, of course, you've got effects like as we warm up, we're more likely to get things like food poisoning, gastroenteritis. But actually, when we looked at all the data, what worried us much more was the fact that as human beings, our health depends on our ecosystems and on our environment. And the biggest threat to me, or the one that is going to hit us earliest, and in some ways is already hitting us, is food security. And we know, for example, from the crop scientists that crop yields are much more vulnerable to temperature changes than we'd formerly thought. And to give you the best example is what happened in Russia in the summer of 2010, when, for whatever reason, there was this intense heat wave for about 2 to 3 weeks, and it devastated the Russian wheat crop. You had a 30% fall in the wheat yield of Russia, one of the biggest global producers. The knock-on effect of that, of course, was to have a devastating effect on food prices across the world. The president of Russia had to stop all exports, as indeed did Ukraine. And the knock-on effect of that was political, because a lot of the Arab Spring was driven initially by great concern about food prices and food riots. Now, in 2008, we saw the peak of food prices when the basket price that the Food and Agricultural Organization calculate reached a peak, and then it shot up again, having fallen in 2010 and through to early this year. So we've seen persistent, very high food prices as a result of effects on crop yields. We're also seeing declines in the corn and barley crops in the US, which several observers have thought are due to rises in temperature. So these are effects that are not 100 years away. I think we have to look at them more seriously now.
So just to be clear about this, I mean, you were saying that there's a very real prospect that climate change could spark armed conflict.
Well, that's another leap forward, because one cannot automatically predict that conflict is related to issues between nations of an economic or food nature. Clearly, diplomacy will intervene. Having said that, interestingly, there was a paper in Nature published just a few months ago where they looked at the effect of conflicts in relation to the El Nino phenomenon and global warming or temperatures in countries. And they found an association, and this doesn't mean it's causal by any means, but they found an association where when it was warmer, the risk of conflict seemed to double. So there may be an association there, but I'd be a bit sceptical of that because, of course, politics can intervene.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig, and today we're discussing the debate over climate change with my guests Peter Wadhams, Anthony Costello, Benny Peiser and Alexei Kokorin. Benny Peiser, let me bring you in here. Your organisation says that it wants to restore what it calls a balance to the debate on climate change. What do you mean by that?
We are mainly concerned with campaigners or activists who exaggerate the threat posed by global warming. Obviously, we are facing a risk, a potential risk, and it's very important to assess that risk reliably and in a way that we can manage that risk one way or another. And it's absolutely unhelpful to have people who exaggerate, because they lose reputation and credibility, and B, it hinders rational debate about what could be and what should be done.
So specifically, what about the current debate do you think is exaggerated?
Well, the current debate, we have several debates. We have the debates among the scientists, which is completely disconnected from the debates among the policymakers. The policymakers are no longer listening to the advice by the scientists. There's a complete disconnect. The irony about Russia, obviously, is that the Russians are desperate to sell as much fossil fuels that they can. And they're pumping oil and gas to everyone and anywhere in the world because they rely 80% or more of their budget relies on fossil fuels, which is why the Russian government is one of the most obstinate on any agreement, and they wouldn't sign to anything anyhow. Just the same with countries that are potentially vulnerable like China and India. They are the ones who will not sign up to any legally binding agreement. So you have different debates. One is the science debate, which is, in my view, a separate debate that needs to be done by the scientists. And you have a policy debate that seems to be increasingly disconnected from anything we hear from the scientists.
On the scientific debate, do you accept the majority of research in this area does seem to show that the Earth is getting warmer? Do you accept that?
Of course. I mean, we're not blind to the fact that we've had a period of global warming since about 1850 or so. But even though, and I haven't seen the Russian report, there are ups and downs in that trend. Currently, we have plateaued. There might be a resurgence. We hear about acceleration. We don't see it currently that there is an acceleration in the trend, but it might happen. Who knows? The climate is a very complex issue. And I think it's very important that we have better observational information so that we really know what is exactly happening in the different regions of the world, because that will inform decision makers rather than the predictions. We need to know exactly what's happening now.
Peter Wadhams, I'll bring you in a moment. But first, Benny Peiser, just let me ask you directly. There's been a criticism of your organisation that you are essentially an environmental voice for the business lobby. How are you funded?
We are funded by individuals. We are the only organisation, to my knowledge, that has excluded, as a matter of principle, any funding from energy companies or anyone with energy interests. So in that regard, we are completely clean. And that was a principle we took right from the start, that we will not take any money, any funding from energy sources. Our main concern is that whatever policies are being adopted in this country and in Europe make sense and don't undermine our economic situation. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, if we are going to face climate change, those countries that are economically strong will be those that will be more resilient to face climate change. If we undermine ourselves, if we become like Greece, they will struggle because they've killed their economy. We don't want to kill our economy because we need a strong economy to face whatever is going to happen.
Peter Wadhams, let me bring you in on that point.
Well, there's several things here I disagree with. In fact, nearly everything he's just said. And firstly, the statement that it's unhelpful to exaggerate.
With the failure to reach a binding agreement to tackle climate change at the Copenhagen summit, are we any closer to finding any global solutions? I'm joined here in the studio in London by Professor Peter Wadhams. He's Professor of Ocean Physics at Cambridge University. Professor Anthony Costello, Professor of International Child Health and Director of UCL's Institute for Global Health. By Dr. Benny. Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Climate change is either the biggest threat facing humanity, with the potential to wreak havoc and cause food shortages, droughts, flooding and even wars, or it's exaggerated and has become more about the politics of the environment rather than the science, depending on which side of the coin you fall on. The science of climate change and what role humans are playing in it has been the subject of fierce debate, but the reality seems largely uncontested. The planet is getting warmer. A recent report in Russia said temperatures there rose at twice the rate as seen in the rest of the world over the past century. But are we getting any closer to understanding why warming is happening and what the implications of it might be? And after
Is that due to Russian emergency ministry as well as Russian hydrometeorological service, growth in temperature in Russia is about 2 times more than globally. So globally it's about 0.8. In Russia, it's above 1.5.
Pizer, he's director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, and on the line from Moscow by Alexei Kokorin, he's Climate and Energy Program Director of the World Wildlife Fund. Alexei Kokorin, let me start with you. This report from Russia would seem to be quite alarming. Why does Russia appear to be warming at double the rate of the rest of the world?
Yes, it's the case